We welcome you to an exchange of stories and experiences by family caregivers of persons with Alzheimer's. If you're one of the 16 million Americans who are helping to care for a loved one living with Alzheimer's, these stories are meant for you. Maybe you've been more and more consumed and homebound since this diagnosis came into your family's life, and less connected with others. I'm Elliot Margolies, and tonight at the Midpen Media Center TV studio in Palo Alto, California, I'm with 7 family caregivers who have come to share some of their experiences. In some cases, their loved ones have passed away. And full disclosure, I too am someone with a father deep into Alzheimer's. The family members here tonight have not met before, but they want to share their experiences in the hopes that our collective stories generate strength and a sense of connection for other caregivers. We begin our story circle after this short video about Alzheimer's produced by the Alzheimer's Association. I'm joined by 7 generous people, and thank you so much for being willing to share your experiences. And before I start asking you some specific questions, if we could just go around, and we're going to start with Martha and go around to say what your name is and who you have cared for.
So my name is Martha Chan, and I've been caring for my husband, Waho.
My name is Sheila Martin, and my father is no longer alive, but I was taking care of him for a few years.
My name's Sue Benjaram, and I don't want to take credit as primary caregiver away from my brother, who's living very close to my dad. And I'm a couple hours away, but I'm filling in as possible.
I'm Bibi Karan from San Mateo, and I'm caregiving for my mom alongside with my father. We are rotating.
I'm Mark Rodden. I'm an only child, and my father had Alzheimer's disease, and I was pretty much in charge of making sure he went well through that.
I'm an only child too. My name is Emmy Gusakuma, and I live in Foster City. My parents both had dementia, and I was a caregiver for about 12 years with the help of professional caregivers.
My name is Gloria Brown, and with the help of 2 caregivers, one for my husband and one with my mom. So the 3 of us are caregiving our 2 relatives.
So you all know I called each of you before the show over the last couple of weeks to learn a little bit about your lives, and thanks so much, so that I kind of heard a lot of amazing things that hopefully will come out in our taping. But I noticed there was a fair amount of parallels when it came to that first phase of noticing something was askew, that there was some confusion or lack of some of the things that they could do before. And I thought, let's start there. And sometimes it's actually going to make us even chuckle. It's not like it's all sad and gloom and doom, but let's start. And I know that Martha, you had a story about trying to assemble something, and there's Kleenex here whenever you
Yes,
want.
I know. He's saying that because I'm a crier. Yeah, my husband, Waho, worked for 30 years in film and video. He was a cameraman. Grew up on a ranch with a father and uncle who could make anything. Their garage was always full of odds and ends that were going to come in handy one of these days, and they did. You need a machine, I'll put that together. So that was definitely his skill set. And one day, he asked for my help to assemble some IKEA metal open shelves in a shed. And I went out to help him, and I thought, well, maybe he just needs me to hold something. He couldn't transfer from the written instructions to assembling the shelves. And I could. That's not usually my skill set. And I kind of helped him, and we put it together. And then I was about to walk away and go back in the house, and I realized that he couldn't replicate what we had just done. So that was definitely a wake-up call. He had been saying for a while when he came home from work, I'm not sure I turned the camera off at the right, I'm not sure. He was beginning to doubt himself and to notice that he wasn't as sharp, but that was definitely one of those moments when I thought, no, there's something big going on. It was hard.
Jasmine, I think you had a story about misdirections or getting your dad picked up.
Yeah, so my dad was at the temple, and we had an event, and my mom used to work the evening shift. So she got off around 11:30, and she was supposed to go pick my father up, and her work to the temple was probably about 5 miles or so. And this was a route she had taken pretty frequently, and she went there every Tuesday all by herself. And there was this one particular instance where she was supposed to pick Dad up, and she ended up driving off somewhere to South San Francisco, or like San Francisco borderline. And she just became very frazzled, apparently. I wasn't there, of course, at the time with her, but what I understand is she became very frazzled. One of the things she did realize is I'm not where I'm supposed to be. So she pulled over to the gas station, and she was able to give my dad a ring. He got a ride from somebody else. They asked the gas station attendant for the address, and they were able to go there and pick her up and bring her car. And when we sat her down and we asked her about it later, she was just like, I don't know what happened. I was just distracted, and I just kept driving, and I had no idea where I went. And she was just very hysterical. So it was quite the realization for us as well.
Sheila, I think your dad got lost when you were in a bookstore. Or
No,
something?
well, that
No,
was
you-
what, but
you-
before
you take it.
then, yes, he did. We were up, but before, yes.
Yeah, go
And
to
I
the
can't
one
remember the time.
before.
So before he was going to the dentist, and the same thing, it was nearby, probably 2 miles from their house down in Southern California, and they, the dentist's office called to my mother and said, "Is Frank coming?" And she said, "Well, he's there, isn't he?" And then my brother-in-law, my sister, and my mother, they were all driving around everywhere down. It was a small town, but looking for him, and he just got lost. So we went to one place where he knew down in the harbor and was parked and just walking around. And someone I don't know how. I actually don't remember how they ever found him, but he eventually got home. But that's when we knew. That was one of the beginning signs.
I think, Gloria, you have a misdirection one
Oh gosh,
as well
yes.
with church? Or?
With church, yes. We've been going to the same church for at least 25, 30 years, and Arthur would always drive my mother and whomever else needed a ride. And I didn't go that Sunday, but within 10 or 15 minutes, they were coming back home, and I said, "I know church is not over with yet, but so what's going on?" And he made up some story, but they were just later I was told that he just lost his way. He could not find his way to church. And rather than admit it, he made up another story, which I think was pretty common. Yes, so that was somewhat of an early sign for us, and a few other things like finding his coffee cup in the cabinet where the pots and pans, leaving the ice cream to melt in the car, and I'm looking at the boxes of Kleenex. I would find so many tissues and toilet paper and paper towels in his drawers. You know, the first time I saw it, I was just in total shock. But those were some of the early signs that something was not quite right.
How about Emmy? Or do you remember any first experiences that were cues?
Yeah, I mean, my mom also got lost. I feel like we all have that story. My mom actually got lost, got very frazzled, and got into an accident, actually. And I don't know how, so the ambulance came, I mean, she was fine. She rear-ended someone. Not a lot of damage to the car. There were no injuries, but somehow she had figured out a way to call the caregiver who called me, and I was in San Francisco working. They were in LA, and luckily I was able to reach somebody who I sent down there to, you know, make sure that the car was sort of secure, and waited until the tow truck could come and get it. But yeah, she was like, oh, it was raining, and it was not really raining. I mean, it was drizzling very lightly. It was LA, so she blamed it on that and didn't really, want to admit that she had gotten disoriented. But at the end of the day, it actually helped because the insurance company totaled the car, and so the car went away. And then I didn't have to have that very difficult conversation with my mom about taking the keys away. She was very upset that I didn't replace the car, and would tell anybody and everybody that I was this horrible person because I wouldn't get her a new car. But it was easier to not replace the car than to take the keys away. So in a way, it was sort of a blessing in disguise, I think.
Sue, I know your dad was in Tennessee, but weren't you getting some calls?
Yeah, his girlfriend there would tell us like that he gave her a drive to the mall and then like forgot to go pick her up or whatever. Or and he's a mechanical engineer by trade, so he's very good with mechanical things. He'd get to the car, I guess, when those new key fobs that don't really have a key to them, he's like, give her a call and like, what do I do, with this thing? He didn't know how to get in the car with the newer style key. So when he was out here, I guess he'll forget that. He'll make calls. He'd call his girlfriend, and I guess he'd not be able to distinguish between like, hi, this is so-and-so, and then it goes like, the mailbox is not set up, and he would take that as somebody's interrupting her talking, like he got through to her, but somebody else interrupted the call, and so he would call, tens of times per day.
And I know, Mark, your parents were in Hawaii, right? Was it your mom who first started telling you something was askew?
That's correct. My dad had always been really good with numbers and with finances, even back in World War II. He was in charge of the payroll for like his whole division. And he, when I was little, people would come over with their income tax and he'd figure it out for them. But then, so he went on, they lived in an apartment building, and he was in charge of the homeowners association. So he kept the books, and he was always very good with his own finances. And I noticed that bills weren't paid, both their own bills as well as that of the homeowners association. He just sort of like gave up and didn't do it anymore. So it was just kind of odd to be really fully functioning and then not doing it.
Did you have words with him about it, or?
Well, I tried to, because I sort of became in charge of the finances of his HOA, and I didn't know, what it was. I just had this pile of papers. So he wasn't really able to explain it too well, but I was able to figure it out.
Did he seem like he didn't want you to know, or?
No, I wouldn't say that. It's almost like, oh yeah, there are the numbers over there. Here are the stubs.
Right.
My father, he would, when my mother was gone, had died, and he would be talking, and then he would forget something, and he'd look at me and he'd say, I guess I have this Alzheimer's thing. And, and I'd say, yeah, it is, but don't worry about it, Daddy. You got me to help you remember things, you know, and so he, you know, he's like, okay.
He was accepting.
You know, I mean, there were times that, I mean, the good news is I'm remembering all the funnier times, but there were times that it was, you know, he was not as accepting, or just it was frustrating to him.
Yes,
but, you know,
right.
when he
could
couldn't
go
find
both
something,
ways.
or, you know, he was the most organized man ever. My mother was the complete opposite, but, you know, somehow they made it work, and he just, you know, not finding things, it was just really frustrating. That part was frustrating. So he wasn't as on top of his game anymore.
I think it was very challenging for us as a family to really talk about it, because the community had viewed her as this person who, you know, is so capable and able. And I think there was this part of her that was just, she knew she was having lapses as well and was having a difficult time talking about it. Specifically with my mom, I mean, she's one of the 200,000 Americans with the younger onset Alzheimer's. And so I try to explain to folks what that's about, and that it's sporadic episodes of Alzheimer's. And so sometimes she's a little more lucid and sometimes not. And again, these are things we don't talk about in our culture. There's a stigma around any type of mental illness or any type of impairments.
My dad had actually told me, even though he knew that it was Alzheimer's, he was told not to say that because he was afraid he couldn't get insurance or couldn't get certain benefits. So the doctor had sort of told him, but never really wrote it down in his records.
We never really talked about his Alzheimer's situation, but in, you know, trying to clean up and poking around, I found brochures.
Can I ask why you chose not to talk about it with him?
He was such a proud person, and I think it would have just been devastating to talk about it. I mean, if we're someone else, it might be different, but for him, it just wasn't really the right thing to do. And I'm glad I made that decision, because we just try to keep things as pleasant and happy as possible. And if he had known that, that would have just worried him, and I'm not sure what he would have done. Yeah, might have been more damaging than I wanted to
Right.
take the risk, right? And at some point, what difference does it make really to the person? You know, it's the family member that has to figure it all out and make the right decisions.
Martha, you said something very poignant about what Wahoo said to you.
You're going to make me cry.
Here's the
No, I've got some, thank you. Always in my
just in
pocket.
case.
No, well, the two things really. One was that we were kind of on a little getaway together and sitting overlooking the ocean. And he said, "Why did this happen to me?" Because he was still, you know, aware enough that he knew that this was happening.
How old was he?
He was 58 when he was diagnosed, so younger onset. Yeah. And, you know, he had still been working and all that stuff. And I said by that time I'd been going to a support group, and he'd actually been going to a support group that Alzheimer's Association, a little plug there, was running for people with younger onset, that the people could be in a group together and just kind of socialize and kind of talk about current events, art therapy, whatever worked. And then at the same time, caregivers, typically a spouse, but sometimes an adult child, got together. And I learned so much from that group. So I was able to say to him, you know, well, my understanding is that there are several things that people can do to prevent it. And I listed all of them. And I said, you've done all of those. It's not your fault. And the other thing that he said that was really hard, it's probably what you were, sorry, I just, was that after he had stopped working, he said, well, if I can't work, what good am I to you?
Because he was a devoted provider.
Yeah, he always, I'm a retired psychotherapist. I worked for nonprofits all my life. So he made more money than he was the primary, I mean, I was working, but he was the primary wage earner. Yeah, and that was, and as I think is true for a lot of us, and maybe a little bit more for men than for women, I don't know. The identity gets really wrapped up in your work and not being able to work and not be able to support the family. It was very hard for him.
What'd you say back to him?
I don't remember specifically. I probably hugged him.
I'm sure it was therapeutic, whatever you said.
Little play on words there, huh? I get that. Yeah. No, you can't really be therapeutic with your own family. Either they don't appreciate it or they catch you in it and kind of go, as one of my kids did once, don't use your therapy voice on me, Mom. I said, it was very rough. And I'm sure everybody went through that, whether your loved one was still working when they became less able, that you just lose pieces of yourself all through the journey.
I think that what I heard everybody tell me about in describing your parents was how capable they were. And I'm going to ask you to share some details as we move through our conversation, but that's a huge shift. I mean, engineers and firefighters and the president of the temple, and so many of these positions that just don't happen to everyone. So
he was self-employed, and so for a long time he didn't want anybody. We couldn't tell a lot of his friends because they were also coworkers, and he wanted to be able to go on working, and he was afraid they wouldn't hire him if they knew that this was beginning to happen. And I finally got permission from him to tell a couple of people that he worked with most often and ask them to let him or me know when he shouldn't be working anymore. So I did get a call one day from a woman, Diana, who he had worked with a lot, who was a friend, and she said, I just wanted to let you know my next call is to Waho to tell him he had just traveled out of state, I don't even remember where, to do about a week-long shoot with her. And she said that a lot of it was unusable, that he had not had the camera on when he thought he had, didn't have it on when he should. It was, and she said, part of it's my fault because I didn't look at the dailies like as faithfully as I should have and catch it in time. But anyway, she called him, and she called and told me he can't work anymore. So she did call him and talk to him about it, and then he told me.
he told you, she talked to him about it?
Yeah, she called me and said, I'm going to call Waho, but I wanted to give you a heads up. And so then she called him. Because she was doing him the courtesy of telling him directly and not having it be on my shoulders. So we talked about that, and it was a pretty sad day.
I don't remember which of you had this great comment about something would happen that signaled kind of a new level of the disease, and it just became the new normal. And you knew it at that point. And I think, Sheila, it was you and your sister with your dad in New England on a vacation that I was remembering.
Yes, it was back in 2008.
So
and
give us the scene.
We were driving, we're from New England, and so my mother was like, I'd love to go back east. So we said, let's all go down. We'll go back there. So we flew to Boston and met up there, and we have still relatives there, so we'd drive around, and we went up to New Hampshire, Maine, visiting people, and so we were in Booth Bay Harbor, and there was a beautiful old library, and it was closed, but there were books, just used books outside, and we were big readers in my family, and so we were looking at the books, and my father just said, I need to go to the restroom, so we're like, oh, it's right behind, and this is what we didn't realize he was bad, would get lost. So it's right behind there, there's public restrooms. He said, okay, fine, I'll go, and I'll be right back. And then it was like 15 minutes later, I'm like, where is he? So then I went and looked, and, he was way down the end of the street, and he was just like looking lost. And so we found him. But ironically, he was at the same time studying for his license. And I'm like, oh my God, there's no way this man is ever going to pass this test. And we'd be driving and he'd say, now see that double line there, Sheila? Can I cross that to go into a driveway? I said, yes, as long as you're going in a driveway, you can do that. And so then he'd say, okay. And then, the next, like a couple hours later, now see that double line there, Sheila? So then I said, really, there's no way. We're not going to have to worry about taking the keys away because there's no way he'll pass that test. And he did.
He passed the test?
He passed the test.
Oh, then what did you do? It's hard
Well, we
to
eventually had to take the keys away, but
I'm sure that was not
once
popular.
he started getting lost, no, he wasn't happy, but he was, that he was accepting, but he didn't like it sometimes. Sometimes we had to hide them just in case he forgot that he couldn't drive anymore. So,
And at least two of you talked about a fall. Emmy, I remember you were one of those who talked about there was a fall that happened.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually how my dad's journey was started back in 2006, I guess it was. He fell, had the subdural hematomas. He literally had like 4 brain surgeries that year because they had to keep going in to remove the spinal fluid or whatever it was. But then at some point, we brought him home, and it was probably a few years later, actually. And this was before my mom's dementia got really bad. So she basically had sort of mild cognitive impairment, and we had part-time help, if you will, no one in the evenings. And I was in LA, actually, that weekend, and it must have been, I think it was probably a Saturday night. And my dad, at some point, had fallen. And my mom was just, she was 4'10", like 100 pounds, so there was no way she was going to be able to get him up. But instead of calling anyone, they didn't call 911, they didn't call me, they didn't call anyone. They ended up basically spending the night on the floor. So my mom brought like pillows and like a blanket, and they just like slept there until the next morning. And then when I came in, I think my mom must have opened the door. I can't remember exactly. And I see in the living room, there are these pillows and the blankets. I'm like, what's going on? Are you having like a camping, like you're simulating a camping trip or something? And she's like, no, your dad fell and I can't get him up. And so I was able to get him up, but it was one of those things like, why didn't you call me? Because I was like 10 minutes away in a Marriott in Burbank. And it was just one of those things where I think it just didn't occur to her. She was, too disoriented, I think, to call. So yeah, they spent the night on the floor, just the two of them.
And
really
Mark,
sad.
you also
Yeah, I had
shared
a similar
story.
situation to that. My children live in Utah, so my wife and I were actually on our way back home from a trip to visit them. And the cell phone reception in places in Nevada isn't always that good. So we pulled off the road at an interchange, and I sort of had to walk around to be able to get through. I did call my folks, talked to my dad briefly. He said, I asked him how they were doing. He said, I'm doing fine. And then I said, how's my mom? And he said, she's on the floor. Oh, I see. And we talked about that for a little while. So I said, well, how long has she been on the floor? And he said, oh, a few days.
Oh my gosh.
I don't think that was really the case, but that's what he thought. And I believed him when he told me that. So we actually ended up calling 911 to get an ambulance for my mom, but explaining to my dad that he was going to call 911 was a little tricky. So he said, oh, so an ambulance is going to come. I said, no, Dad, you're going to call an ambulance. So that was a difficult situation for sure.
Yeah.
My dad was falling prey to a lot of scams. Like if you get something in the mail, it's just like, you should give us money or Social Security is at risk. Some organization basically scamming people, and my dad was writing lots of checks to a variety of these organizations, and including, I guess, something for like Saving the Wolves, which anyway is something that I guess he would not normally do. And you tell him, like, Dad, you wrote this check for Saving the Wolves. Saving the wolves? What?
Some of you talked about how some of their behaviors became very different than how they were before Alzheimer's. And you know, either an exaggerated reaction or a violent reaction or aggression that wasn't who they were. And so I would like to, and I know most of you had something like that, so I'll start with Gloria.
Sure. So Arthur was a project manager for the federal government, and he was pretty detail-oriented and, you know, pretty structured. Although he was gregarious and enjoyed people, he was always the social butterfly at events. And so when the Alzheimer's began to really take hold, he was not able to do some of the things that he would be able to do in the past, and he would become quite agitated. In some cases, very agitated. There were a couple of incidences on the block, and we've lived on the block for 50 years.
And he was the guy that would see
he's
if
the one that would go down to City Hall and you know, on behalf of one of the neighbors and be an advocate for them, and then to flip the switch and just kind of almost charge at the person. They didn't know how to react, and so I ended up going to each of their homes on the block and explaining Arthur's situation, and the neighbors were so understanding. A number of them had relatives who had Alzheimer's or dementia, and so they understood. But he would try to stop traffic in the middle of the street, and you know, it just caused all kind of havoc for a while. That has stopped. So he's in another phase of his Alzheimer's, but that was a very difficult time for all of us. You know, police came a couple of times, and I just think first responders need all kinds of training. I'm not sure they know how to respond to a person with Alzheimer's that is in that state.
Right.
Prior to this phase now, where my mom is a lot more, she's easily agitated. She wants to sleep a lot. You know, she's very, like, let's say she wakes up and you're trying to take her to the restroom or something, she'll react very differently than she would in the past. And so one specific example, and this is kind of recent, a couple months ago, it was the first time, and she gets a little upset when, you know, you take her to give her a bath, and she's afraid of the water. You know, it doesn't feel good on her body. I think it's very painful for her, and she's got other, you know, again, comorbidities that might be attributing as well. And so she was sleeping, just like a 20-minute nap, and I remember I was getting her up, and I was about to take her to the restroom, and you know, sometimes she'll recognize you and sometimes she won't. And I think she woke up kind of in the midst of half asleep, and she kind of smacked my hand really hard. And at first I kind of just was very taken aback. You know, of course I didn't expect it. And then I remember I just got very teary-eyed because it was in that moment, you know, similar to what, Gloria, what you're saying is, it might be easier on you at that time, but you're realizing the disease is progressing. And so for me, it was really in that moment. I mean, I've had a lot of these moments where it's suddenly like, oh my gosh, mom is really progressing and you know, really declining and getting worse.
My mom, she had bouts of aggression as well, sometimes toward my dad, which was really kind of heartbreaking. But this one time, she was just really upset, agitated, aggressive, and they were standing, her and the caregiver were literally standing on the sidewalk right outside the door, right outside the house. And the caregiver is like, Emmy, you know, your mom, she's screaming. And I could hear my mother screaming in the background. You're so stupid. I mean, she's just, I mean, and everyone in the neighborhood could hear her, right? Because the one thing my mother never lost was her voice. So she's super loud, really tiny, very loud, right? Kind of like our Welsh corgi, really small, very loud bark. But and I could not calm her down. You know, she gave me the phone to try to calm my mom down. I was like, "What's going on? What's happening?" And you could tell the caregiver was very upset, and it was humiliating or embarrassing for her too, because you know she's standing outside. People are beginning to peek out their windows and wondering what's going on, and my mother is calling her stupid and other really not nice things. And so I said, I finally told her, I said, just try to get her in the house. Once you get her in the house, just leave. Like, we'll pay you for the rest of the day, but you need to remove yourself from that situation, because I didn't feel that she deserved that. And I'm also an employment lawyer by trade. I'm like, this is a lawsuit waiting. So she left, and thankfully she was fine the next day, and she continued with us. But it was a really difficult situation, you know, and you don't want the caregiver to be in that situation. You also want your parent to be safe, so you're trying to balance all of these things. But thankfully, you know, she was calm the next day. So,
Sue, you mentioned a situation. I don't know if it came to blows, but it was in the facility.
Right.
Yeah.
So my dad is in a memory care unit. Like, once we brought him out to California again, 2 years ago, he was just a facility that has a memory unit, but otherwise is independent living, and he only was in the independent living for a couple months, and they realized he needed the higher level of care. But anyway, there's been multiple institutes and or instances, including one just this past weekend, again, where, and of course, memory care is mostly female patients, because women tend to live longer. So I don't know how many women there are in this facility, just like 2 or 3 guys, I think. He tends to want to defend the women. Sometimes caregivers will be coming to take a woman to her room, I guess, to go to bed, or, you know, to bathe or whatever. And he must be misinterpreting the situation, and at times he has hit staff. Like, he's in a pretty good situation, so you really hate to have anything that threatens the status quo.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, even with him being familiar to the staff and they to him, there was a lot of effort to move him, and don't want to repeat that anytime soon.
The caregiver has been incredibly helpful. He has taken coursework and is moving towards a certificated program, and working and caring for Alzheimer's and Parkinson patients. And so if it takes Arthur 35 minutes to decide he wants to just sit and not move to the next level of doing something, he's just patient with them. Whereas initially I would be very impatient, because I needed to get other things done and accomplished. And that has cut down a lot of the aggression and anxiety that Arthur had experienced before. Just an extremely patient person. So that has helped in our situation.
Mark talked to me about wandering, and I don't know if others have wandering stories, but I'd like Mark to tell a couple of your dad.
Sure. Yeah, there are several that ended up being kind of troubling. My mom had some physical disabilities, so she had this go-kart kind of device. I think she bought it at Walmart, and my dad would use it when he'd go shopping. She would send him to go shopping, and it worked out perfectly fine for that. One day he decided to go for a ride, and they live on Rengsdorf, and he ended up all the way over by Foothill Expressway.
Like 3 miles away.
Yeah, he realized that this was a street that he didn't know. Fortunately, he knew not to cross that street. So he was, at that point, he was still able to use the telephone. So he called me and told me that he went too far, but we didn't know where he was. So it was a bit of an exercise to figure it out, but eventually we did. Another time he wandered, most of the times he got in trouble was when my mom had to go to the hospital. So he was left by himself or with us. So when that happened, once we had him over at our house instead of his apartment, and we were just working in the kitchen or whatever, and all of a sudden he disappears. So I decided that night I'd go over to his house and I'd sort of sleep by the door. And this was a little strange. The next morning he said, "Hey, Mark, there was somebody here last night." I said, "Oh, who was it?" And he said, "It was a communist." I said, "No, that was me."
Can you describe your father as you grew up, like what you saw your father as?
Well, yeah, he was a firefighter, and he was in the Army, and he was always quite in, I always looked up to him. He was always in defending others and public interest, public service. So it sort of went full circle because we got to be known by all of the police around here. And that was really weird. When my mom was at Saratoga retirement home for a while, my dad was still pretty good with geography. So he realized that Highway 85 went from where he lived to where my mom was staying, but he didn't have a car, so he just went for a walk on Highway 85. That was freaky. He got stopped by the highway patrol. They got a hold of me, and they said, "You should come over to his house." So I go over to his house, and the highway patrolman answers his door. And I go inside, and there's another patrolman in the living room. And then my dad is there looking kind of sheepishly. He said, "Hi, Mark," So we realized we had to do something at that point.
I can't help but see a little twinkle in your eyes when you're telling these stories. I think part of you might feel a little proud of him. I don't know. What are you thinking when you say those?
That's true. He was independent and had a good time at it. I don't think he was ever sad about his situation. We were, but I don't think he ever was.
Wow. Wow. And Gloria, you told me something. It's not a wandering story, but just how different the behavior could be from the man you had 50 years with before, and that was the napkins. So would you mind sharing?
Oh, jeez. We spent lots of time in different restaurants. We enjoyed going out to eat. We would just, pick a new restaurant. And I began to notice when we returned to the car, Arthur would have a napkin, the cloth napkins in his, and he was so clever. While we were eating, I never realized he was putting the napkins in his pocket. So we must have at least 20 napkins at our house, all different colors. And so towards the end, we of course don't go out to dinner as now, but I would tell the person, the waiter, "Do you have any paper napkins?" And they just look at me real strangely. I said, "You have to understand, my husband loves to take the cloth napkins with him. And so if you just bring several paper napkins, then you won't have to worry about what happened to the napkin." You'll see napkins, Kleenex, paper towels, and they'd all be stuffed in his drawer. Several drawers in his man cave area.
In everybody's situation, even though there are moments that are more lighthearted or that are more connecting and we look for the positives, as you've so eloquently said, there are other times where we just feel totally overwhelmed by it.
If I'm under an inordinate amount of stress, like there are times, I'll have a migraine. And I remember there was this one particular instance where early on, after she was diagnosed, my mom had a very difficult time with coping with the loss of, no longer working and just all of the change. I mean, it was very overwhelming for her, and you could see that it was. During this time, you could tell there was a lot of pent up anxiety. And she was trying to sort through whatever was going on. So she'd wander around the house, and I don't know, I can't recall or specifically, I want to say I was probably a little sleep deprived. I think I'd slept 3-4 hours the night before, and then gone to work, and then came home, and I was doing the mom duty, if you will. And I was really stressed out. I don't know what brought it on. And the migraine came on, and I just remember becoming very sensitive to the light and to sound, and my mom's just walking around and she won't stop pacing, you know, and that's all I hear, her footsteps like just everywhere, all over the house, you know, and she's going to the door and she's moving the doorknob and she's looking for my dad, really what's going on, because her and my dad did everything together. And so now she's home and he's at work in the evenings and she's wondering why he keeps leaving her, and she's sad and mad at him that he's leaving and not realizing like she's sick. And so I remember it just got so bad and I actually fell to the floor. And I just remember like kind of almost blacking out, but not really, enough to the point where I was able to grab my phone and I called my sister and my brother-in-law, and they came. And thank God they lived close enough. And so those were the moments, like especially that one, it was very frightening for me. I was very scared. And I just remember thinking to myself, you know, if something happens to me, how can I care for her? Like, what can I do?
He woke up in the morning and was very confused. I mean, not just confused, but he was having a psychotic episode. He did not know where he was. He did not know who I was. And he had gotten up and gone to the bathroom and then came back into the room. And I was just kind of waking up thinking, oh, okay, so we're starting the day. And I got out of bed and he curled up on the bed in this almost fetal position and was just terrified, but couldn't tell me what he was terrified about. And this is going to sound weird. I had a sleep shirt that had bears on it that are like about this big, you know, it's like hibernate was the joke in the sleep shirt. And he became frightened of the pictures of the bears. So that was really awful. And that was toward the end of, that was one of the indicators that led me to think, after I told my kids about it too, they got very quiet and then said, so Mom, is it safe for you and for Daddy to have him at home? I was like, oh, I kind of hadn't thought about my safety, because he hadn't been a wanderer. He would get lost if he tried to go someplace without me, but we dealt with that. But it hadn't occurred to me that something could happen to me, and then what would, so that was bad.
But did he?
He came back eventually, and I don't remember now. I wrote all about it in a journal. I could have brought the journal. I think he eventually was, I just sat on the bed with him, and a touch is just so important in my voice. And, you know, and eventually he calmed down. My memory is that I was able to get us both dressed, and we just kind of went outside and walked around a little bit. And that helped too, that somehow being outside and kind of in our very familiar neighborhood seemed to help too.
We brought him into the emergency room and he had to get a catheter, and he didn't understand what it was. So he yanked it out. I can't imagine how painful that would be. So I think he did that more than once. So they actually had to put a straitjacket on him, and this was extremely difficult. And he started yelling at me, and it was sort of the only time he really verbally abused me ever. And it was just very hard for everybody, certainly the people that had to do it, and my wife and I. And
for those of you who did end up having to get your parents into one or get your loved one into one, what are your memories of the beginning of the staying in a facility or moving them there?
Well, my mother was the one who had to sign the paperwork because she was still able to do so. And my dad didn't really understand what was going on. He would say things like, well, where are we? Well, this is where we live. Well, how long are we going to be here? Well, the rest of our lives. And so that was hard for him to kind of understand what was going on. On the other hand, my mother really did understand it, and she was signing it. And as she was signing it, she just started crying and weeping and bawling, and she just burst into a pool of tears. It was really sad. But eventually she realized that she had to, because she knew that she couldn't take care of him and I couldn't take care of both of them.
When we were trying to even discuss it with my mom, it was just no.
I didn't tell him, I didn't talk to him about moving him out of the house. He was, sounds awful, he was far enough gone then that he kind of didn't get a vote. And I feel bad about that, but he wouldn't have agreed to it or wouldn't have remembered it the next day. So I took him to the facility after we had moved some of his stuff there and lied to him about why we were there and left him there. So.
Not easy.
No, no.
Not an easy script at all. And especially with the age that this amazing cameraman came down with Alzheimer's is something that's hard to, it's hard to hold it. Yeah, you've been through a lot.
Yep. Gray hair.
Yeah. I remember you talking about romance at the facility.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you live long enough to be in your 80s or 90s, you know, you're a hot commodity as a man in a skilled nursing facility. And so some woman who actually was living in the memory care, the life guidance, but still had her spouse in the independent part, decided my dad was her husband. And so he, you know, fed into this delusion that this is his wife, and if any time we would go to visit, he doesn't want to leave her. He's like, "Oh, Ron, don't leave," you know. And so that was kind of hard for us. It's kind of hard that he. So, like for Thanksgiving, you bring him over to my brother's house, short distance away, and he's only there for a short time. Not even all the guests have arrived yet, and he's like wanting to go back to his people at the memory care. And you're like, you know, we're all gathering here for you.
When her legal husband came to visit?
Yeah, and then of course, I mean, like I said, I wasn't there, but that yes, some altercation or argument, and
They were fighting over her?
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Well, did he? He
And
did
I think he
he
may
was her husband,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So obviously
they
that was
both
going to be a
thought-
problem.
Yeah. Your dad had a point where you were told he's kind of not appropriate for this facility level anymore.
That's correct.
Right? Somebody else brought that up, I think
It's a
Sue,
risk.
about
Yeah.
you're always worried. Are you going to get the call where they say he can't be here anymore? And can you share how
Yeah.
that happened?
What it is it was a formal eviction notice, the sort of thing you'd expect to get if you didn't pay, the rent.
He was going to a really good senior day program in Mountain View that's run by Avenidas, the senior center there, because I was still working part-time and it didn't feel like a good idea for him to be home alone. He wasn't a wanderer, but it just the lack of stimulation if I was going to be gone for 4 or 5 hours. So I talked him into trying that out because he was not very excited about it for 2 days, and then it went to 5 days, and he was there for over 2 years. And again, the decline was such that at some point the staff there said he's not really be able to participate very much in the program here, and not now, but in a while. We're probably going to ask you to find other placement.
They have a receptionist right by the front door, and part of her job is to make sure that the people who are inside don't go outside. My dad had been a building inspector for a while when he was retired, and he just knew a lot about the buildings. So there are only about 4 units that are independent living. And he went to one of the independent living units when the maid was cleaning it. So he went through the door and then went outside to the front. So he was outside in the front. And it was a pretty sad situation because he had to go to the bathroom. So he sort of walked down the street and then found an ATM and assumed that that was a toilet. But one of the ladies who worked at the hospital was a facility was on her way home, and she saw him. So she stopped, turned around, and said, "Let's go back in."
Wow. But that led to him being
Evicted.
evicted. There's some touching sides throughout this, and I'm thinking of Sheila, your Wednesday nights, and your dad getting a new job or whatever.
Oh,
Can you take us into that?
Yeah, I'll do. It's a kind of a combined, but I'll do Wednesday nights. The caregiver. I had a caregiver, and different hours, and so I could go to work. And then we had someone on the weekends. But on Wednesday night, she had during the week one had to leave by 5:30. So I'd leave work, go home, and we would be sitting there. And you know, similar to what you were saying, he would say, "So what's on the program for tomorrow?" And I had this little game I would play in my head where I wanted to answer that question, no matter how many times he asked, the same enthusiasm. So it was like my little goal in my life. So for that time period. So I'd say, well, Daddy, you know, I'm going to the office, but Sylvia is going to come in, and now which one is she again? I'm like, you really like her. Okay. So then this would go on and it'd be 50 times, and I'd be like, are you tired? No, because he had been in bed since like till 3. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I need a break. So then I said, you know what? I think Wednesday nights are going to be our night to go out to dinner. So then we would get out of the house, and then during, you know, when my mother was in the hospital before she died, I said he loved wine, and I said, I'm going to start giving him like half non-alcoholic wine, just to like, and she said, I think it's a great, he'll never know the difference. And he never did. So then I just moved to non-alcoholic wine. So at home, he would have a couple of glasses of wine. You want another one? Sure. So then we'd go to a restaurant and have one, and he'd be like, woo. You know? But anyway, so on the last Wednesday night, we were going to, we were on our way, and I said, you know, he used to go with Sylvia to Denny's, and you know, that wasn't something he would be doing, like nothing against Denny's, but he liked, you know, he liked something besides Denny's. So I said, we go to Denny's, something, you know, it's easier, I'm exhausted. I'm like, no, wait, let's go to the Lobster Shack, because it's New England, it was in Redwood City. So we went, and so his last, because he died 2 weeks later, but went in the hospital the following weekend. But his last meal was a lobster roll, chowder, and blueberry cobbler, and a glass of wine, and a good big one. And that was really wonderful. But the other thing you're referring to, I would come home some nights, and he would say, "Hey, come in here," and he'd already be in bed if I was later, and I could tell there was something different because he had some energy, you know, at night. And I'd say, "What's up?" And he said, "Sit down, I've got some news for you. We're going to be moving one time we were moving to Singapore, Chicago, Hawaii. The business was sending us over to fix it because he was a very good businessman, and we were going, and you know, we would go into these, it would be an hour-long story, and I'd say, and what else are we going to be doing there?" And he'd say, you know, well, who else should we bring? I'm like, well, how about, you know, so-and-so? Yeah, that's a good idea. We'll bring them too. And then he would say, what about a car? Do we need to buy a car? I'm like, oh, it's cheap to live over there. We'll just have a driver. Oh, that's a great idea. And then he told me that he said, I'm going to buy you a whole new wardrobe. And I said, oh, why don't we just wait till we get over there? Because they make everything over there anyway. So we'll just buy the clothes there. He's like, okay, perfect. And then, like, you know, we just would go. It was so much fun. I wish I recorded it. But then he said, but I think you're going to be very happy with the salary. And I said, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a good one. I'm like, what am I going to be making? He said, we're doubling what you're making now. I really wanted to know what it was going to be. So that happened a few times, and I just went with it. And I'm like, this is just, I'm loving the energy. I don't care if it's all crazy. It's hysterical.
Absolutely.
And it was a gift, you know, because he loved working, and he just felt like he still was. So it was great.
Gloria, you've referred to a gift as well in Arthur's life, and kind of yours too, in terms of the caretaker that takes some place.
When the caregiver entered into our family, I call him one of our family members now, in his culture, they have lots of family activities. So Arthur goes to Tupperware parties, he goes to Chuck E. Cheese, he goes to, you know, Avon parties, and he would have never, ever broached going to any of those kinds of activities. But he has the best time, and he comes home, and he is just, you know, kind of a different person, similar with your dad. And I just play it up to the hilt. And the caregiver is a happy camper because he feels he's making a contribution towards Arthur being as happy as he can be. So, yes, I'm sure he doesn't even know what products Avon has, but it doesn't really matter. They're eating while they're there, so they're both happy about that.
Thank you all for the sharing tonight. I have a feeling there's going to be people in Wichita and Fargo and wherever that stumble upon your words, and it's going to be helpful. And I want to thank the people surrounding us are volunteers, and I want to thank them for giving up an evening to make this program. The people in the control room as well. I want to thank the Alzheimer's Association and Avenidas in Palo Alto who brought me in contact with you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.